Hello, I have the pleasure of introducing Edward Mazria, who is a fellow of the American Institute of Architecture, founder and CEO of the nonprofit Architecture 2030. He is an internationally recognized architect, author, researcher, and educator. And over the past 4 decades, his research into the sustainability, resilience, energy consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions of the built environment has helped to redefine the role of architecture, planning, design, and building in reshaping our world. He was awarded the 2021 AIA Gold Medal for his unwavering voice and leadership in the fight against climate change. But even more than that, Ed is a hero. He's a hero because of his actions, which have led the field of landscape architecture, and now also, architecture and landscape architecture together, through the gateway of being recognized at COP26. For landscape architecture, this was a gift of great enormity and great importance. Ed welcomed landscape architecture into the built environment conversation around carbon, first by inviting a very close friend of mine, Pamela Conrad, who is also a landscape architect, to speak at his Carbon Positive 20 conference in the spring of 2020 in Los Angeles. Pamela had started her own organization called Climate Positive Design for landscape architecture, which was modeled after Ed's Architecture 2030. This started a friendship between them, and since, Ed and Pamela have created an important alliance between their respective organizations. In the spring of 2021, Ed invited Climate Positive Design to include the global landscape architecture profession as signatories of the 1.5 degree built environment communique crafted by Architecture 2030, which is being shared at this year's COP26 in Glasgow. This invitation sparked the motivation for creating the International Federation of Landscape Architecture Climate Action Commitment, which I did participate in, which was recently ratified and represents over 70,000 landscape architects from 77 nations around the world at COP26. With Ed's actions and openness to collaboration, we are now a unified multidisciplinary collaboration where all professions within the built environment have the knowledge and tools to be able to address the cause of climate change and its future impacts. So Ed, thank you so much, really, in behalf of the global profession of landscape architecture, for your generosity and perspicacity. Your work is a gift to the world and brightens all of our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martha, for that very nice introduction. It's great to be here. We have a really great program. So let's get started. We have a number of issues that we want to discuss. So let me begin. In 2007, we held a global emergency teach-in out of New York City. And we invited Jim Hansen as one of the participants, one of the speakers. And I was sitting on the podium with Jim. And in 2007, we were about half a degree Celsius warming above pre-industrial levels. That's where the planet was. And I asked Jim, I actually leaned over and asked him, I said, when are we going to see the impacts of climate change and global warming? And he leaned over to me and whispered, at about 1 degree C, we'll begin to see the impacts. So I got on the NASA website and looked up what global average temperature was today. And today it's at 1.02 degrees C, right at 1 degree C. And all hell is breaking loose all over the planet. So Jim Hansen was right on the mark, as he usually is. So why is this important? In December 2012, the world got together in Paris at COP21 and agreed to limit global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C warming. And it was ratified, and all the countries ratified that. We're at 1 degree C now. Why is that 1.5 degrees C so important? Well, the IPCC ran a whole number of scenarios of how much carbon we put it into the atmosphere. And they ran 4 scenarios. These are 3 of the scenarios. You can see that if the planet goes past 2 degrees C, again, we're a little over 1 degree C right now, just at 1 degree, and all hell is breaking loose. So that was a half a degree from 2007 to now. You can imagine what another half is going to do, and imagine what 1 and 1.5 is going to do. We'll go over that too. But if we sail past that 2 degrees C, there's so much inertia in the climate system that the planet keeps on warming, and it becomes irreversible in our lifetime, our children's lifetime, and their kids' lifetime. So we want to stay at that 1.5. It is really, really important. When they ran the 1.5, what was fascinating was that the planet actually stabilized at that temperature. Once we stopped, if we met the carbon budget, once we stopped emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, we met the carbon budget and also the other greenhouse gas emissions. And with drawdown, natural drawdown, and also if we draw down, we can actually begin to reduce the temperature over a long, long period of time and bring it back to pre-industrial levels. It'll take a long time though, as you can see. Okay, so what does that half a degree difference mean? What's the difference between if we shoot past that 1.5 and go to 2? We hear a lot of people saying, oh, we want to stay under 2. Well, that's 2 very different futures, 1.5 and 2. Let me tell you what I mean. At 2 degrees C, if we go from 1.5 to 2 degrees C, so just a half a degree Celsius, 1.7 billion more people will be exposed to severe heat waves every 5 years. Think about that. The entire Western Hemisphere, North America and South America, that's the US, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, all the countries in our hemisphere, that's 1 billion people. So you can imagine what this number is, 1.7 billion people, more people. That's just that half a degree. 100 to 400 million more people will be at risk for hunger. 400 million is a little more than the population of the entire United States. 1 to 2 billion more people will no longer have adequate water. And 1 billion people may be forced to migrate. So we need to hold that 1.5 and get very, very serious about it. And we're beginning to run out of time. We know what the issue is. The issue is fossil fuels. We're burning fossil fuels and putting CO2 up into the atmosphere. And today we're putting about 40 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. If we peak emissions now in 2020, and we will this year just because of COVID, 2021 will peak, probably be slightly less. And then we hear all sorts of countries and governments and NGOs and everyone else saying, well, we need to get to net zero by 2050 or 0 by 2050. If we take a straight line down and phase out CO2 emissions by 2050, that's 600 gigatons of CO2 we put into the atmosphere between now and 2050. That gives us less than a 50% chance of meeting that 1.5, of staying at that 1.5, less than 50. Now, you're beginning to hear all sorts of countries saying, okay, well, we'll reduce emissions by 50% by 2030 and then phase out all CO2 emissions by 2050. Well, that gives us just a 50% chance. So that's a 50-50 chance. Given what's at stake, that's not good odds. 50-50 is not good odds with the planet. So what do we really need to do? Well, we need to meet that 50%. by 2030, and then phase out, straight line down, all emissions by the year 2040. So the 2050 date has moved up to 2040. That gives us a good probability of meeting the 1.5, a 67% chance. And we're asking the building sector and the built environment to do better than that. And we'll drag the other sectors along so we at least get a 67% chance. So we're asking our sectors to get to a 65% reduction by 2030 and then phase out all emissions by 2040. That gives us a better than 67% chance if the whole world does that, but at least we'll try to get to that 50 in 2040, 50 by 2030. Okay, so how difficult is it to meet those targets? It sounds daunting. We need to get to zero carbon. We're calling on our industry, everyone associated with the built environment, the architects, the planners, the landscape architects, engineers, to get to zero carbon today, not wait. And there are 3 steps now to zero carbon in the built environment, or as close as you can get. Those steps are: 1, design to the latest code standard. We have great codes. We've developed incredible codes. If we just meet the latest code standards or do better through design, then we have a very low energy and emissions building. And I'll go through that in a minute. Step 2 is design all electric and then use renewables for the electricity. No on-site fossil fuels. And then 3, zero out embodied carbon in both buildings and infrastructure. It takes a huge amount of carbon to make all the materials to build out the built environment going forward from here on out, and the infrastructure associated with that. So let's start with design to the latest code standard. What do we mean by that? Well, this is the amount of emissions and energy, this amount of energy consumption and then associated emissions of 100,000 square foot office building, roughly in the year 2000, 2001, 2002. This was a survey done in 2003, okay? So this is how much energy those buildings use. Now, our latest code standards are 90.1 2019 ASHRAE and the IECC 2021. It's not being adopted yet widely, but some states are beginning to adopt it. Oregon, for example, adopted the 2019. Where does that get us as opposed to where buildings were at in year 2000, 2003? Well, this is how much energy a building will use if we meet those code standards today. So designing to those code standards is very important. Getting them adopted is critical, but we don't need to wait for a city to adopt it to design to those standards. We can do that. All the city does or a state is set a minimum standard. They don't tell you how much above you can go. So we need to design at least to these standards or better. What's interesting about this is that the plug load, which the code really doesn't address, is almost half the load now because we've gotten the building down in terms of its consumption so much that only in that blue part of the bar is what's left. And you see the same thing in building type after building type. First thing is design an energy efficient building, design to use the codes or use parts of the codes. And then there's all sorts of other strategies, which we'll talk about in a bit. Daylighting, passive heating, cooling, ventilation, efficient systems, controls. There's all sorts of ways you can get it down even further and squeeze out even more energy. So the building uses very, very little. Okay, 2, design all electric plus renewables. No on-site fossil fuel, no gas, no oil, no propane, all electric buildings. So let's take a look at that. So first we design an efficient building. Next, we design all electric. And then we address the remaining building's energy needs, because it's all electric, with either on-site renewables. If the building is efficient enough, you can do it probably on-site, or you can do it, you can import and purchase and procure offsite renewable energy. If you do that, you have a zero carbon building operations. Not very difficult. What about all the existing buildings though? We have, trillions of existing buildings out there in the world today. How are we going to get them to zero carbon? Well, it's the same formula. It's efficiency plus electrification, get rid of the on-site fossil fuels, and then use renewables for the electricity, either on-site or off-site. And we discovered something really interesting. This is New York City. You can see the little circles in the left. That's Midtown Manhattan, downtown Manhattan, and downtown Brooklyn. In those red circles are about 2% of the total buildings in New York. That's what you see on the screen is all of New York City. All the other buildings account for about 1 million buildings. But those buildings account for only 2%, about 20-something, 26,000, something like that. That 2% of the buildings, which are huge, account for 48% of total building sector emissions in New York City. So they account for half of all the emissions in terms of building operations of all the buildings in New York City. You can go to city after city and go way out and look at the topology of these cities, and you see, like in Denver on the left, along the waterfront, huge buildings, and then miles and miles of small buildings. In Philadelphia, the same thing. You look at Los Angeles, same thing, downtown, these huge, huge buildings, and then miles and miles of small buildings. You would see the same thing in Sydney, Australia, same thing in Guangzhou, same thing in Turkey. Big buildings in the downtown area, and then miles and miles of small buildings. Same thing in Nagasaki along the waterfront, huge buildings. And then back of it, miles and miles of small buildings. Same thing in Long Beach. So given that, we can then, with a very small number of buildings, knock out half of all emissions, efficiency, electrification, and renewables. So we can give the big buildings a date certain. We say by 2030, all big buildings responsible for half of all those emissions, which are a very small number, should be very doable. They're not wealthy if they own these buildings. They're usually going to have a capital improvement cycle. You require them to get to zero carbon, go all electric, and use renewables for the electricity. And you can provide incentives. Give them low interest loans, give them tax abatements, give them equipment rebates. There's all sorts of incentives you can give them. So when they hit a capital improvement cycle before 2030, they make that transition. It's not a big transition. You can get at half the emissions of cities by doing that. Well, what about the other millions of small buildings? I mean, there are a lot of them. Well, you have to use intervention points. You can't burden people to make transitions. They may not have the money, whatever it is. So you use intervention points. When construction is going to take place, at point of sale, the new owner coming in has financing, has money, is usually going to make changes. You require them to go to zero carbon. And you provide these same incentives for them to do that. If you're going for a zoning or use change, if you're doing a renovation, if you're replacing equipment, you give them incentives to do it right and to go to zero carbon. But by 2040, you require all those buildings to get to zero carbon. That's how you address the existing building sector. Okay, what about all the materials? That has been a problem up until recently. We have not wanted to think about it because there are literally hundreds of thousands of materials to choose from when designing a building or building out infrastructure, the roads, the sidewalks, the landscapes, the lighting. I mean, there's brick, wood, concrete, steel, tile, sheetrock, ceiling tiles, lighting fixtures, wall base, you name it, paint, glass. I mean, there are so many materials to choose from. We scratch out how the heck we're going to get a handle on all this. And in every product category, there are literally thousands of materials. Well, we discovered something very interesting. This is the way we usually see global emissions divided up. Building operations, 28%. We talked about that. Industry, where all of that is in, plus agriculture, plus your cell phone, plus books, plus cups and saucers, plus everything that's made, falls into industry. That's 43% of total global emissions. Then you have transportation, which is 23%, and then a few other things. But most everything else falls into that industrial sector besides transportation and building operations. Well, how do we get a handle on that? That's everything, right? Well, we discovered something really interesting. Concrete and steel are responsible for 50% of all industrial emissions, roughly. And if you throw in aluminum, you go slightly over that. Aluminum's a small piece, but it's still a big enough piece. So just like big buildings and small buildings, very few big buildings and millions of small buildings. In industry, you have concrete and steel and aluminum, and then everything else. So if we focus on concrete and steel initially, and then bring the rest along, we can get at the entire industrial sector. So now what? Well, the first thing we need to do is change the conversation. And roughly a year and a half ago, that conversation is changing. And in mainstream media, finally got a hold of concrete and steel. In The Guardian, concrete, the most destructive material on the planet. In Bloomberg, steelmakers next in the crosshairs as climate pressure grows. So now we know, and we're getting it out there to the general public and to professionals and everything, that steel and concrete have to reduce emissions. And the good news is they have some competition. Glue laminated timber and cross laminated timber, if they come from sustainably managed northern forests, existing northern sustainably managed forests, they are a competitor to steel and concrete, and architects love wood, and it's giving steel and concrete heartburn. So you're now seeing steel and concrete saying, oh, we're going to get to zero carbon by 2050, or we're reducing our carbon footprint. And they're actually beginning to do it. So what can we do? What do we as professionals and those involved in the built environment, what can we do? Well, we can reuse, reduce, and sequester. Let's start with reuse first. The greenest building, development, or neighborhood is one that is already built. So you want to upgrade and repurpose urban areas, renovate existing buildings, use local and recycled materials when you can. And then if you're designing new buildings or even infrastructure, design it to deconstruct once the life expectancy is met and their lifespan is over, that you deconstruct and you can reuse pieces of that building or infrastructure. Reduce growth boundaries, so we're not expanding out into the suburbs all the time, building new infrastructure. Infill. There's so much land to infill. Someone was telling me in Chicago, for example, you can infill another Chicago into the existing Chicago right now. And we know that densification actually reduces carbon, is less carbon intensive, and it's not a COVID spreader. We know now that densification is not a COVID spreader. It's overcrowding, piling into, a sporting event and things like that is really a COVID spreader. You can optimize structure, for example, use less material, and we're starting to see now public policy change and address that. And then you can sequester carbon. You can get rid of it. Sustainable and glue laminated timber, again, from sustainably managed forests. And now we're beginning to see sustainable glue laminated and cross laminated bamboo in the global south, just beginning in its infancy, but has incredible potential to reduce carbon. You could make aggregate out of carbon. We have one or two companies now that are doing that and are beginning to look to spread for the financing and everything else. We have many actually companies now that are injecting CO2 into concrete, make it stronger, reduce the The hardening cycle, you inject the CO2 and it changes its properties. It's gone forever. So you take that CO2 and inject it. And we now have some companies looking to develop a full cycle plant where they make the cement and then take the CO2 from making the cement and injecting it into the concrete mix so it becomes zero carbon. Biomaterials made from that are manufactured with renewable energy are an incredible way to draw down. And landscapes, soils are a great way again to reduce. We talked about Pamela, Martha talked about Pamela. She's got a great program that'll tell you how much you can sequester in different landscapes, going from hardscape to softscape, and bringing urban agriculture back into urban areas is huge, because then we don't take up all this land and we begin to grow our own food within the urban setting. So these are all strategies that we can do. So can we meet the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget that at the beginning of this seemed quite daunting? Well, this was Toronto in 1891. You see all masonry buildings, small spaces inside, wall to wall, wood spanning from wall to wall. You know, all the exterior walls were bearing walls. Everything was low rise during that time. So how did we go from that? You see the Flatiron building still stands in the left-hand side there. That's essentially what we call an industrial or pre-industrial building. And look at all the high rises with horizontal windows, bands of, just all glass boxes. How did we go from that to this? And how long did that take? And who did it? And how did we do all that? Well, the first modern building that's considered the first modern building is the Bauhaus. And there's debate, but 1925's first modern building. Let's consider it the first modern building. You can see that structure now moves inside, no more bearing walls, it's point loads. So you have columns and beams. You open up the floor plan, you can go from wall to wall, exterior wall to exterior wall, and you can hang the facade off of the structure, so it's not bearing. So you could make it all glass and highly transparent horizontal windows. That's considered the first modern building. So what was going on in 1925? Well, you had the Model T truck. It was pretty primitive. You didn't have television. You had radio vision. You had radio waves, and you projected on a wall. That was 1925. We didn't have the first transatlantic call. Think about cell phones now. We can call anywhere and look at anybody and talk to anybody. We didn't have the first transatlantic call till 1927. So that's what was going on when the first modern building came on the scene. Well, in 1928, conditions were very bad in Europe, and the architects and planners and landscapers and building sector people and built environment got together. The leading figures of the time got together and held a congress, the International Congress of Modern Architecture. And they did that because housing was so bad. People were dying of emphysema. All the housing was in the industrial areas. You couldn't even see the brick anymore. It was covered with soot on houses. So they set out a whole set of principles, guiding principles for this new modern movement. Function-based zones, get the housing out of the industrial areas, put them in high-rise housing blocks, get solar exposure, get sunlight into them, give them abundant put them in parkland, free and efficient circulation. The automobile was coming in at that time. So they set out a whole bunch of planning principles. And then Le Corbusier set out the architecture principles for actual building design, column wall separation, like we saw in the first building in the Bauhaus, that free up the design of the facade, horizontal windows, free up the design of the plan so you can have big open spaces. And what was interesting is he called for any land that was taken up on the ground floor by the building to put back up on the roof. We're beginning to now finally see some of that. So by this was 1932, the US got a hold of the style and they brought it to the US and they call it the international style because we brought it from Europe. And now we can put it anywhere in the US, in the South and the North. because we can climate control these glass buildings. What was going on back then? Well, we didn't even have a commercial airport until 35. And then you see by 39, we had the Johnson Wax building, beautiful, big open space floor plan. By 49, Philip Johnson did his all glass house. This is a single glass house, all four sides, climate control in a very cold climate. It's really like a tour de force. By 52, we had the beautiful Lever House, single glass curtain wall building hung off the structure in New York City. And by 56, we had an entire city that was developed and planned along the principles of the modern movement. So how long did all that take from the Bauhaus to the Lever House? That was 27 years. Think about that, 27 years. And we did that with these tools. These are the tools we used back then up until the late 50s. A T-square, a triangle, you had to dip a pen in an inkwell and then draw. There were no erasers. When the ink got under the T-square and spread all over your drawing, you had to scrape it off with a razor blade. It took years to do a set of construction documents. We changed the world in 27 years with these tools. We didn't see the first ink pen until 1960, and then the first computer until 1992. The first laptop came in. So we changed the world in 27 years with these primitive tools. Think about it. Today, we have the 2030 palette. The 2030 palette has all the design strategies for cities, landscapes, buildings, for creating sustainable cities and regions, to developments, to districts, all the way down to buildings, and now we added building materials. And this is all available online free, and it'll be updated this next year. And think of all the other tools that we have. We can look at anything, daylighting, we can structure anything, and we can design it, create the construction document, and build it. And we can look at cities. We have incredible tools. So to finish, solar is now the cheapest electricity in history. Can we meet the 1.5? Of course we can. Let me show you where the US building sector is right now. In 2005, we issued the 2030 targets. We alerted our sector, our architecture sector in the US that this was a problem, and we wanted them to design a lot more efficient, 50% more efficient, both new buildings and renovations, so that we cancel out any kind of increase in energy consumption as we kept adding buildings to our building stock. Never happened before. This is what happened since that point. From 2005, our energy consumption has actually gone down about 5 to 6% in the whole building sector. And our emissions are now down 30%. And we've added 60 billion square feet to our building stock and haven't increased our emissions one iota. We've reduced it 30%. And if the government makes good on its pledge for a clean grid by 2035 and puts out some incentives, we should easily be at 72% below 2005 levels by 2030 and phase out CO2 emissions in our sector by 2040. This is a model for the rest of the world. So we have implemented a communique. We're calling for countries to meet the 50 to 65 by 2030, 0 by 2040. And essentially, the top 60 firms in the US, more than the top 60 US-based and European-based firms, have signed on, responsible for over $300 billion worth of construction worldwide a year. And pretty much all the major organizations have signed on to the communique asking the countries to do this. We'll deliver this in Glasgow in a few weeks. So can we meet the 1.5? Of course we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Ed for your presentation and all your work on the 2030 challenge. Your presentation and work is incredibly urgent and so inspiring to see this presentation today. I'm grateful to be able to discuss with you further. For the audience, my name is Kathlyn, a current Master's of Architecture student at the GSD. My pronouns are she and her. I have long dark hair, hoop earrings, and a dark colored turtleneck. And I'm honored to be on the traditional and ancestral land of the Wampanoag, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Cambridge. So now, Ed, in response to your presentation, I'd like to launch us into the Q&A. I'd first like to start off with a couple questions before opening it up to the audience, who I'm quite sure there has many activity there. So my first question is in regard to the now. As we stated in 2005, the 2030 challenge was issued as a means to create incremental carbon reduction goals over a 25-year timeline that would be consistent with those of the global scientific community. Today, 2030 is considered too late by many in the scientific community, that we should be there today. Predominantly, when we think of the word now, we think about the urgency of this very moment, this very second, minute, and hour, but we are already seeing the effects of climate change. We obviously won't be able to reduce carbon emissions by tomorrow. So can you break down what the now means for those in the building industry?
Yeah, for us in the built environment, the now means designing, if I'm a firm, we're asking all firms to design to zero carbon today. That means that I design a very efficient building, and then I use on-site renewables when I can and where I can. And then I import and procure off-site renewables. The key to all of this is designing all electric, is not designing with any fossil fuels. And we know that that's cost effective. It's healthier. We don't have natural gas in buildings, and it's easy to do, and it's probably less expensive. So if we design all electric, if we design an efficient building, and the palette and other instruments have all the techniques that you can use, and you know, we also hear from architects and planners, well, we can't because our client doesn't want this or doesn't want that, or it's too expensive. That's all bogus. It is really nonsense. We as architects and planners decide pretty much everything. We make thousands of decisions as we're designing a building, where to locate it. The client doesn't get involved in that. It's shape, its form, its layout, where we put fenestrations, its orientation, its color, all the materials. You think a client reads a spec book this thick? They don't read the specs. We control all that. So to say, well, the client doesn't want, just with the design strategies, we can get a building that uses very, very little energy. And then we just make up the rest with renewables. It is really easy to do now. And we have so many tools at our fingertips. We can do it now. So we're calling on the entire community that develops and builds out the built environment. We also have material choices. We can choose from all sorts of materials as long as the prices are within reason, and we can trade off things so that we bring the building in budget. As long as we bring a building or infrastructure in budget, client is happy if we give them something that's really beautiful, and we give them something that costs less to operate and really helps the planet. So we're calling on everybody involved in our sector to do that now. And we can talk about education. That's another whole issue.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you kind of queued it up very nicely for this next question. I think you focused a lot on practice, and I think there's this great call to action. So the question is, how can education, core curricula, and pedagogy aid in achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius goals?
Any university, if you're a student in a university and you're not getting educated on how to design to zero carbon and how to look at the potential impacts of what you're designing out into the future, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because there are going to be impacts, not only this year, where all hell broke loose globally, but that's going to continue on until we really get a handle on this for quite a long time. So you need to design for that. If you're not getting that, then the university is negligent. I can tell you right now, the university is negligent. And in a sense, since we're responsible for these emissions, it almost borders on criminal. So in every university, and I'm talking about design studio, that's the main course that everyone takes. And then there are all the adjunct courses that kind of fit into design studio. In every studio project that a instructor gives a student, they have to get to zero carbon and look at the potential impacts in that area and design for those impacts. That must be an imperative in every university, professional school, and even the non-professional schools.
I absolutely love that. The integration of sustainability and sustainability design into our studios and making that a core feature of it, I think, is incredibly important for designers entering the field.
Alicia, if I'm an instructor, and let's say I don't know that much about this, I haven't done my research, I haven't done studies, and I haven't done it. Just give the problem to the students. If you're an instructor, you learn more from the students. What does the student do when they get a problem? They go out and they investigate it, right? And the first pinup is all the information they discovered. So if you give them that problem and you say, okay, it has to be zero carbon, and what are the potential impacts? Within 2 or 3 studio problems that you give, the instructor will be educated from the students. So you don't have to be a genius in this. Just give out the problem, and let the process play itself out. But it's critical that this happens. You see, people's lives are at stake. We just talked about 1.7 billion people, over 1 billion people migrating and going without adequate, a billion people, all of North America and South America, everything in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, and we're not addressing that in our profession, and we're responsible for the major portion of emissions. I can't tell you how, what that means. It's mind-boggling that to today, it's still not the norm in many institutions.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of core responsibility to the individual, I think this really brings it down to scale. And the feedback loop that you're talking about, this idea of learning together to get through this together, I think is incredibly important, and it's part of the learning experience.
In my first lecture, when I discovered this issue way back, I was at the university, where was I? I was in Syracuse, right? And I ended the talk with a slide of my son and my granddaughter, who was on his shoulders. They were at Disneyland. She was like 6 years old, maybe 5, 6 years old, right? And I said, we're doing it for the kids. Let's see, last year she graduated college. We're just starting to get a handle on this. And these kids now are coming into this stuff, so they're being affected. What about their kids, right? We have an obligation as educators to educate every single person that graduates from a professional institution on how to on going into the firms now, which are all now 60 of the biggest firms in the world, right? And now all pledged to meet the 1.5 within their practices to get to zero carbon and begin designing to zero carbon now. So we're going to supply them with professionals that don't know how to do this. It's really not tenable. So every institution has to look at themselves now and really make those changes very, very quickly. Time has run out. So the clock has really run out. If you haven't done it, you need to start tomorrow and do it.
Yeah, I think we had discussed earlier about this idea of productive impatience, and I think this is definitely a call to action, especially in the education field, and how powerful it can be for practitioners out there. I think you made a really good point about future generations that I want to touch on. So this 1.5 carbon emission goal, or 1.5 Celsius goal, is it's being presented as an endpoint. And I wanted to try to break this down for us a little bit more. What kind of maintenance will need to be happening after we reach the 1.5 carbon Celsius goal?
Right. Well, this year was a banner year in terms of impacts, right? All hell broke loose everywhere in Europe, in Russia, in China, the flooding, in central China, in the US with forest fires and flooding. I mean, you name it. And now you have sea level rise creeping in as another thing, the heat island effect and global temperatures going up. That's going to get worse. That is not going to get better. No matter what we do now, that's not going to get better. But what we want to do is try to control it to that 1.5 and not let it go past that. Because what the scientific community is saying is, if we control it to the 1.5, it's going to be dicey, but we can design to it, right? We can modify it. We're going to have to help out the less wealthy countries because they don't have the wherewithal, but the design strategies to address these issues is there. So with sea level rise, there's retreat, there's all sorts of ways to deal with that. California is doing it now on their coast. They're actually buying up buildings and leasing them out so they get their money back. And then when sea level rise, they become untenable, they then take them down. So there are all sorts of ways to address this issue. This needs to be taught in school. So we need to project out and the projections, the scientific community has done the projections. So we have a really good idea of what the temperatures are going to be if we meet the 1.5 and down the line in the future. We know where sea level rise is going to be roughly. So we know all these things, and that needs to be taught. So we need to project that out and make sure when we're designing today, since buildings last a long time, that we take those into consideration in our design so that we can manage it between now and 2040 and then beyond. If we go beyond that 2040 date into the 2050 and 2060 and go and sail past the 2, it's going to be trouble. It's going to be trouble. And we have a responsibility not to put the global population into that kind of trouble. I was just going to say, and to say, well, it's not us, we're just designers, is really shirking your responsibility.
Yeah, I think, this past recent year, we've seen an incredible upheaval of our lives. And I wanted to ask you if you had seen a greater coalition building around climate change because of many natural disasters occurring, and then on top of political instability, wars and famine, the list goes on and on. Have you seen greater urgency and call for coalition building, and does it help with the cause?
I think, when I asked Hansen that question, when would we see it? And he said 1 degree C. And I got on and all of a sudden, everything is, climate change is everywhere now. And headlines are coming in from China and India and, and Europe, cities and towns just being flooded out and what happens in California and the Pacific Northwest, that has, when I asked him that question, my thought was, what was going through my head was, we're just not going to do anything until we see that we're able to see this and feel it and taste it and understand it. And without the impacts, it's going to be really difficult. And when he said the 1 degree, and that gets us so close to the 1.5 that it almost becomes too late, but it's not too late. Scientific community says not too late. We still have one opportunity between now and 2030, the next 8 to 10 years, 2031, to really get it under control. And if we do that, the inertia from 2030 to 2040 will take us there. Because even though a country says, well, I'll get to the 50% now and then I'll phase up by 2050, They'll phase out by 2040, but because every 5 years, you have another meeting of all the countries. You look at the impacts and then you increase your ambition because the impacts keep adding up, and you begin to see that. So I have no doubt that if we address this between now and 2030, get to that 50 to 65% mark, that will phase out easily by 2040.
I thank you for breaking that down. I think it's an incredibly optimistic view, and it's very refreshing to call our hands
where we
together.
are.
Yeah.
Look, we're 30% down. You know, we only have, in our sector in the US, in operations, now we have to get embodied, but in operations, we're almost there. We're down 30%, another 20% over 8 years is a no-brainer. If Biden makes good on a clean grid by 2035, the building sector, just the buildings alone, just buildings, use 75% of all the electricity generated in the US. So think about if he cleans it up, you know, we'll be in the 70% range and everything else if we design better and if we do the things that we know how to do now. Will be easily sail past that 65%.
And I do want to get an audience question in here before we wrap up. So we have a question from the audience asking, would replacing our energy sources with renewables mean that we can reduce our carbon budget without decreasing our energy use?
The answer is yes. If I have an efficient building, let's say I have an efficient building now, let's say I designed it to the latest code standard. Efficiency is usually the least expensive option than adding renewables on site, because adding renewables actually costs you something, although you get paid back in the long, you know, it's so cheap now, the solar, that the payback is very short. So you actually get paid back, but there's a first cost. But we're beginning to see incentives for that. But the answer to that is yes. But you want to do efficiency first, and then, if you can, and then go to renewables. If you can't, then you go to the renewables. But you want to do efficiency first before going to renewables, because think about it. We're going to have a transportation system coming in that's going to be all electric, essentially, and needing electricity, and essentially in the industrial sector also. So there's going to be other players who are going to want renewable electricity. So the more we can make available to them, since we use most of it now, most of it goes to buildings. If we make our buildings more efficient, we loosen up a lot of renewables for other sectors to get to zero carbon. That's why I say we need to go to 65% while they're trying to get to 50, because we can do it.
Thank you so much, Ed. So now we're approaching the end. So I'd just like to say it's been so inspiring to listen to you talk and to live up to this call to action. I certainly feel energized and ready to launch into this moment. And so I'm very grateful for this summit and also this discussion with you. I appreciate you for joining us and sharing us your knowledge. So I'll turn this now over to Peter for closing remarks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kathlyn, and thank you, Edward, for your brilliant leadership. Your work has transformed design practices, organizations like the Architects Institute of America, and governments by challenging all of us to take immediate action to combat climate change. I am Peter Kroom, chair of the Harvard Graduate School of Design Alumni Council, and more significantly, I and my firm, Sage & Kroom Architects, are signatories of the AIA 2030 Challenge that Edward's vision catalyzed. More than a year ago, the Design Impact Series was proposed as a way to virtually fulfill the mission of our Alumni Council to engage with and advocate for our community. On the 1-year anniversary of our first volume, or summit, we are concluding our 5th Design Impact Following the Sun, Design Futures at the Intersection of Health, Equity, and Climate. We brought together an outstanding roster of 48 global leaders to share their work and vision and celebrate equity, diversity, and inclusion. We aim to transcend regional and national boundaries to unite our global community of practice, challenging us to use design as a tool for actionable transformative change and healing, to design positive impact, an arc that ran through the 12 sessions and was amplified by Walter Hood, Everett Fly, and just now by Edward Mazria. We are excited to bring you more design impact events. If you're interested in getting involved and have topics or speaker recommendations, please reach out, and we look forward to changing the world together. It has been said by Anna, it truly takes a village to host a global community. The Alumni Council is deeply grateful to our village of outstanding presenters, moderators, session leads, event organizers, production teams, event partners, faculty member Martha Schwartz, Department Chair Anita Berzvieta, to the GST leadership, our inspirational Dean Sarah Whiting, and our true partner, Associate Dean of Development and Alumni Relations, Peggy Burns. And to all of you, of course, who lead our community and make design impact possible, we profoundly thank you. And most of all, a special thank you to the audience. Before we leave, I want to take a moment to spotlight an initiative of the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, the Racial Equity and Anti-Racism Fund. In the summer of 2020, the GSD established the REA Fund as a step towards addressing the GSD African American Student Unions and African GSD notes on credibility. Those notes delineated the historical and systemic inequities of our school, and rightfully noted that we have an obligation to address injustice and discrimination. The REA's stated mission is to raise awareness of racism and racial injustice while promoting a culture of anti-racism at the GSD by actively advancing and supporting a diverse community throughout every level of the institution, from supporting student recruitment and retention to conferences, community work, courses, workshops, and events. Since its inception, 11 grants have been awarded. I believe my colleague Lindsay will put a link to those grants in the chat. The Alumni Council strongly supports the mission of the RE Fund, and we hope that you will too see that these efforts need our support to succeed and that you are equally committed to its success. Please consider making a gift to the REA Fund. A link will be shared in the chat as well. We believe gifts to the fund are investments in support of future design leaders and a small step towards making the GSD and the design fields more equitable.